Thanks, Cinda. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I'd also like to reiterate that we are gathered here today on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I acknowledge their stewardship of the land. And it's very significant because this book, City in Color, is about the first immigrants to British Columbia. And many of them, well, they all came because of the colonization policy of the Hudson's Bay Company, which built Fort Victoria and, of course, which started British Columbia. And so I really want to be able to thank the Indigenous peoples who were here before us. So I believe that everybody has a personal story to tell, and you don't have to be famous or even infamous to have your story have an impact on others. I'm going to share with you, I'm going to be speaking to you from my experience of writing this book, which was published in 2012. It's called A Cowherd in Paradise. It is a memoir, and I'm going to share with you some of the processes and tools that I used to get this published. So we're going to start off with an agenda because I tried to be organized. We're going to be speaking from experience, as I said. I'm going to give you some tips. I've got a takeaway sheet that you can take at the end of the workshop. I'm going to introduce you to a genre called creative nonfiction. And we're going to have two very short writing exercises. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to write, and then you're going to hopefully take a couple of minutes to share with one another, because again, you were really great in that last workshop with Sally about sharing with each other, because I think that we're here to inspire one another, and you might take away some ideas that, can get you started on your work. I'm going to give you some, as I say, a handout with some resources on writing, on building your credentials, and on publishing. And if I do this right, I will have some time for questions and answers. So, let's say you have an aha moment. You've overcome some barrier, it could be anything, and you think that others can learn from your experience. But you just don't know how to start. Where do you start writing things down? The most obvious advice that you'll get from most people is just write. But what do you write? How do you start? How do you organize that information that's in your brain, in your memory banks, to make it interesting enough to potential readers who don't know anything about you, don't care about you or your story? So let's get back to some basics, because sometimes that's just the simplest way to start. So tip number 1 says, use the W, 5, and H. What the heck am I talking about? So I'm referring to the basic journalistic questions of what, who, when, where, and why. These 6 practical questions can help you get started on your writing. Now, how many of you have already written memoir, want to write a book about it? Okay. But going through these 6 questions will help you determine your main message that you want to convey and the lesson that you want the reader to learn. So what are you writing about? What's the main message that you wish to convey, or the lesson that you want your reader to learn? I wanted to inform the public about the impact of 2 historical discriminatory laws against the Chinese, and only the Chinese. So the book is about social justice, equality, and hopefully being able to learn from the past mistakes of the past. I thought it would be easier for readers to relate to a personal story of one family than to try and understand the impact of those laws on a whole generation. So I decided to go for creative nonfiction memoir rather than a history book. Now, as a person of Chinese background, married to a non-Chinese person, I've always been interested in social and intercultural relations. And my career in the BC Public Service has involved me in the creation of public policy and laws, and of course has exposed me to politics. What is the story you want to tell? Now, my mother told me stories about her life and our family all my life, and she wanted me to record those stories. It took me a while before I got started, though. She grew up as a peasant girl. She took care of the family's water buffalo. That's why I called it a cowherd, because at the age of 10, she took care of her family's most precious commodity, which was a water buffalo, because her family actually planted and grew rice. So, but she survived natural disasters, wars, the communist revolution, and then her resilience in adapting to life in a 20th century foreign country was, to me, significant and quite inspiring. So I started writing about her. And at the time, my father was quite a peripheral figure. But as I continued to write about her, I understood that his immigration story was just as important one and no less inspiring. He actually paid the $500 head tax, and our family was directly impacted by the immigration law of 1923. That particular law shut the doors to Chinese immigration to Canada for almost 25 years. So my parents were married over that time. My father actually came to Canada, and then after about 10 years, he gathered enough money to go back to China to get married. And that Chinese immigration law was in effect, and so my mother could not come. My parents were married for over 50 years. But in order to support his family, my father had to work and live in China, as you know, a whole generation of Chinese men had to do at that time. So my parents were forced to live in separate countries. They had separate lives. My mother in China, my father here, and as he made enough money, he would go back to China, and he did go back to China a couple more times. So as you can imagine, they had a very complicated relationship. So, who are you writing about? Is it about yourself? Are you the main character? Do you have a supporting cast? Are you perhaps honoring a significant other person, whether that person had a positive or negative effect on your life? So in this book, I'm writing obviously about my parents and the supporting cast of my nuclear family. Who is your audience? This will help you determine some of the information, some of the content that you will include in your book. Let's say you're writing just for your family. You want your kids to know about your history and the history of their grandparents, etc. And so you might include more personal insights into the relationships that happened between family members, some of those past events, and some of the actions of the past. You might also do this if you want to do it in a public way as well, as C. Gutkind did. If you're writing for the public, the main idea has got to be relevant and be able to draw readers into your story. And from the very beginning, I knew that I wanted to write for the public because I wanted this information to be more broadly known. Where does the story happen? Is it a particular place? A community, a country? It can range from a specific incident in a single setting to a journey across the globe. So this book is set in British Columbia, Montreal, and Guangdong, China. When does the story take place? What's the context? What else is happening in your family, in the community, in the country, or around the world? And how are those events related to the story that you're writing about? And how are you or your characters being impacted by that particular history, by the things that are happening at that time? Generally, memoir is going to be about a specific time frame and a significant event in your life. So some of the things that Sally got you to think about. This book is more like a biography. It covers 100 years of history, and from the birth of my father in 1902 to the death of my mother in 2002. Why this particular story? What have you or your characters learned from the experience or the relationship? How have your characters grown and changed? Is it your purpose to inform people of something, to entertain them, or to persuade? Now, in addition to informing the public about an historical injustice, I wrote this story to honor the lives of my parents, the sacrifices they made, and I wanted to impart the lessons that they had taught me to a broader audience. How did your characters feel or react or change over the course of this particular story in your book? My mother learned to be self-reliant, and her essential nature was empathetic and giving. But living with a man that she hardly knew in the second half of her life was a lesson in forgiveness. And my father also became self-reliant, of course. He was a self-made man, and he was always looking to belong to a family and to a country. How are you going to organize this book? Is it going to be chronological, or is it going to be told in flashbacks? Is it going to be a collection of essays? Are you going to be including photos, poems, or drawings? So those are all kinds of things that you have to think about when you're putting your book together. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to ask you to do a short writing exercise. So try to answer those stories, those questions in the story that you want to write. Who are you writing about? What's the story? Where is it going to take place? When? How and why? There's no wrong answer, but what you do, you might want to share with one another or get some ideas. Yeah. So we're going to take 3 minutes. So tip number 2. I assume that you've all been reading, and reading very broadly, whether you're reading memoir or any other genre, and you're learning about writing from that reading. There's lots of books in the library about writing. I would encourage you to take full advantage of that free resource. But I also encourage you to take courses, if you can, on writing. Don't need to have an MFA, but writing courses every once in a while, do help get those writing juices started, and that creative motivation that you need when you're doing a course. And keep attending writing courses, writing conferences like this. Know the market. Which memoirs have been successful? Which memoirs have you liked to read? And what are the similarities and differences that you can offer in your book? Because that is going to give you an advantage when it comes to being published. So I've always loved to read and write, and during my career as a policy advisor and project manager, I always wrote. But it wasn't until I retired that I started to write for pleasure and for publication. I took a UVic extension course on travel writing because I thought, well, I'm retired, I can go traveling, and so that's what we tried to do. And then my mother came to me in a dream. And that's when I knew that I had to start working on writing about her. And I knew I needed help too. So I took a memoir writing course, writing in creative nonfiction. And the first one was this course on creative nonfiction. So what I've done is I've taken a book written by Gutkind, who is known as the Godfather of creative nonfiction. What the heck is creative nonfiction, and what? So this is where I'm going to probably be repeating a lot of the things that you've already heard all day from Phil, from Sally. Creative nonfiction, as you can see here, it's very succinct definition, and I've highlighted the words that you need to remember, and that is that creative nonfiction is presenting real stories about real people in a dramatic fashion. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Sounds hard, too. So what is literary craft technique? Anybody? Yes? So literary craft technique is using those techniques that fiction writers use, that people who write films, theater, plays, crafting scene, which we heard about earlier, recreating dialogue, writing compelling description, and even changing point of view. So these are the kinds of techniques that you can use to present memorable stories and characters. Now, one of the trickiest challenges is to recreate dialogue, and I'm the first person to admit that it still daunts me. But Gutkind says that this is an important and necessary tool in writing creative nonfiction. The way your characters speak to each other shows their personality and the mood, and the dialogue can often show that more succinctly than you can by describing, this guy was upset or that person was happy. The way they talk is very, very effective. And from these two paragraphs, it assures us that the words do not necessarily have to be exact. In fact, it'll be impossible to be exact unless you're a stenographer and you were in the room typing everything out that your characters were saying to each other maybe 50 years ago, right? If you're talking about your grandmother or your parents, or even if you're writing about yourself, I can't remember what I said yesterday, let alone 50 years ago. But two things have to remain true in the way that we recreate and write dialogue. It has to be true to the relationships between the characters, so that what they say to each other and how they say it must be true to the relationship that they have with each other, and that as we remembered them. And it also has to be true to how they express themselves. So what do I mean by that? So when my parents spoke to each other, which in my memory they rarely did, the conversation would quickly turn into a disagreement. So I can't have them, having a nice conversation about, oh, how was your day, honey? Because that just didn't happen, okay? One would say that and the other would say, it's none of your business. So I have to make that relationship true. It has to be true to how the characters express themselves. So when my father spoke English, he had a very Chinese accent, which I tried to recreate. So it's got to be as true as you remember it, okay? And I remember the people exist, the events existed, the dialogue might have existed as you recreate it, but it has to be true to that time and place and that experience. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? But I'm going to give you a resource about additional reading that will help you and help you learn these things. Now, you're going to start to see that I am a list person, because it helps keep me organized, and as I grow older, I tend to need them more and more in my everyday life. So it's just who I am. So how did I start? I started with the small details, snatches of memory from my mother and my father as I remembered them. Okay, so I made lists. And yes, this is the name of my list, How to Be Mommy, because everybody called my mother Mommy. So in that first memory, hi dear, I could see you. Even as I say it, I can hear my mother's voice. And it is one of those things that you need to think about when you're thinking about who you're going to be writing about. This is how she spoke in her later years, and this is what she was like to all of my non-Chinese friends. The second line there is about what she looked like and how she acted and how her body was when she laughed. She would laugh with her whole body. Her body would shake, and she would have tears coming out, and she would close her eyes, and she would snuggle her head to the left. And even as I do this, I can see my mother in front of me doing this. So it's these kinds of intimate details that you write about that will create those characters that your reader can close their eyes and imagine when they're reading, okay? The third point, eating rice and making sure that she taught us that every drop of rice was a drop of sweat, was a reality for her as a young child, because rice growing is a very difficult task. And it was a reminder for me to research what rice culture was like, and the importance of the family's water buffalo. The last one, Speak Your Mind, relates to her character. She was fearless. She spoke up when there was injustice. And it also relates to the focus of the book, which is about fairness, equality, and justice. So my daddy list: every time I smell Old Spice aftershave, hot cooking oil, and hair pomade, I think of him. Now, he became a restaurateur. He owned a restaurant in downtown Montreal. And knucklebusters and billy clubs aren't what most restaurateurs bring to the job, but he worked the night shift. And the restaurant was located downtown Montreal, right next door to a couple of very, very popular nightclubs. And the guys would come in, at 2 o'clock in the morning, wanting a snack, and they would try and leave without paying. But there was Daddy at the door with his billy club in one hand and his knucklebusters in the other, ready to stop them. And then he would call the police. And he would have to take them to a small claims court in the morning. And so again, a reminder for me about what he was like. How many restaurateurs do you know who carry a billy club to work? And a reminder of me of how about fighting for justice, literally, right? The last point there about all sitting together in this nice peaceful setting talks about our uneasy family dynamics. I said my parents had this complicated relationship. Well, it made for uneasy family dynamics. I was very close to both my parents because I was the last child and their surprise baby. And so I became the communication conduit between them. And that's how I knew them so well enough to think about them and write about them. So it's these small little details that you can start with that will help you create and build a three-dimensional character. All of these next tips are going to be tools to help you recall those memories. Of course, make lists. Use all 6 senses: sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touch, and feelings. Think of those, again, those intimate and specific details to help your readers imagine and remember the characters and the scenes that you write. What did your character look like? What were their facial expressions, their choice of clothing or hairstyles or makeup? What was their posture? What are their gestures? Do they use their hands when they talk? What did their voice sound like when they spoke to you? Did they sound differently when they speak to other people? Was it loud? Was it soft? Was it angry? Was it tender? Did they speak much or rarely? What did they smell like? Did they use perfume or body lotion? What smells remind you of them? When you think of a place, is there a smell that reminds you of a memory with them? Maybe they took you camping and every time you go into the woods and you smell the cedar trees, you think of them. Or maybe they took you to the ocean and that's what you smell. How about a stuffy house, musty old clothing, or foods or drinks that you associate with them? And remember, it's them, time, and place. Were you or they touchy people? Did you hug, kiss? Did you hold hands? Or were they hitters or slappers? Did they keep a physical distance from you? What feelings do these memories evoke in you, then and now? What feelings were your characters expressing, then and now? When you think about it from a distance, how do you interpret some of those actions and those feelings and those motivations? Use photos, videos, conversations, whether they're taped or not, as memory aids. One way of trying to get information, and this is from a question from Sally's workshop, talk with other people about your character or about your own memories. Everybody has their own perceptions of what happened, and they might not be the same as yours, but it helps you build a sense of place and time when you incorporate some of those perspectives in your writing. So what was their point of view in the same events that you're describing? Gutkind talks about immersion as a way, a tool to really know a subject intimately by, let's say you want to talk about dating. What kinds of dating situations, and so you're at several different dating situations, and that gives you an insight into how people look, how people act, what's happening there. So I lived with my parents for the first 25 years of my life. I was apart from my mother for 8 years before she came as a widow to live with my husband and myself, to live for another 15 years. So no wonder I can still clearly hear my mother's voice in my head. So we're gonna do another quick writing exercise using the 6 senses. Write down some memories of either sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touch, or feelings that relate to your character or to your story.
Actually, my dad's car used to smell like cigarettes and aqua velva because he smoked in the car, so he'd sprinkle aqua velva to get rid of the smell. So then you'd smell cigarettes and aqua velva, and I got car sick a lot as a kid. It's really hard. So those smells have made me throw up now.
So Brill cream good, aqua velva bad.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go on. So later, I want you to follow up with some of those memories and write a scene about each of those memories. And if you continue on with that, you've got the start of your book. So scenes. So scenes are the main building blocks of your story. Gutkind says that scenes must contain action, because this is what makes a scene come alive. So from those lists that I made, my mommy list and my daddy list, I crafted scenes that were significant throughout their lives. And I made another list of what those memories were, what those significant moments were, just like Sally made us do, right? What were those significant memories in your life? So for my mother, here are some of the things that I thought were significant. The first time that she rode a water buffalo. She was quite young. She took over the job from her sister. Her first photograph, which was taken at age 18, which she knew would be used by a matchmaker to get her a husband. Because at 18, she was already getting to be really old. Interactions with her grandmother, who was a very significant influence on her young life. Her wedding night. And her arrival in Canada on Christmas Eve, and what that meant. Moments for my father included the day he was sold by his opium-addicted family to a family of means. It was a good thing for him because he was actually able to come to Canada because of that. His arrival in Canada on the Empress of Japan, and then being quarantined like a prisoner when he arrived. Choosing his wife. My mother did not see him until after she was married. It was too late by then. Celebrating the birth of his children. So you've got nonfiction information. This is the main message that you wish to convey, but there's also background information that puts the story into context. So what do I mean by that? The main information that I wanted to convey was these are the kinds of things that kept my parents apart. These laws actually happened. There was social injustice, and we need to learn from those kinds of things so that they don't happen again. So I had to research the history and the politics of China, Canada, and the world, and their interactions with one another. Specifically, I had to learn why and how the Chinese head tax and the Immigration Act came about, and the effects of those laws on a whole generation of families. I wanted to find out if their experiences were similar or different from those of my parents. The appropriate context, the when, the where, the why, the how, those 5 journalistic questions, adds to the reader's understanding of your point of view as well. Factual details adds to a story's authenticity. So one chapter is about my mother's relationship with her grandmother and the lessons about justice that she learns from the older women. And the relationship grows when they share time together, such as bathing grandmother's feet. And I had to read about foot binding, why it was so popular, and how it was done. Fact check for accuracy, because your readers will. More than one writer's credibility has been questioned and found wanting. And perhaps the most infamous story is the one about James Fry, who, if you can reach back to the good old days of 2003, Oprah Winfrey just gushed about this guy and his book called A Million Little Pieces. He was a drug addict, and he said that he was imprisoned for certain things, and until somebody investigated his story and found that he had exaggerated just a little bit too much and actually made up some stuff to make his story more saleable and, more amazing. Well, he lied. But the fact that he wrote it as a memoir and that he lied, his credibility just went down the drain. Real life as I said last night, can be as fantastical as science fiction. And you don't need to make up stuff in order for people to want to read about it and for people to be interested in your story. And if you're writing about a certain date or a certain place and the history of that certain place, make sure that you check those facts. And your editor will remind you of that. So my sources were interviews with people who knew my parents, and some of whose histories were similar, others which were different. I used the resources of the local library a lot. I read a lot of books about history of these places, and I read a lot about other people's memoirs about that time as well, because there are a number of Chinese memoirs very similar to this. It wasn't until I found some key information from the National Libraries and Archives Canada that has immigration lists that I got some key details of my father's entry back and forth from China to Canada, that I was able to write more confidently about him. And so, there's all kinds of resources that you can use that will help you get those facts, that will give you those authentic details. And I also found that municipalities and cultural centers also have some very wonderful resources. So on the one hand, you have your story, the story about my parents. On the other hand, you have, and those stories are written in scenes, and on the other hand, you have that factual information, that non-fiction information that provides the context and the idea and the reasons for your book. So how do you structure all of this? Gutkind calls it a dance. He alternates between scenes and information. And this is when you can present or tell your information. You've all heard about the writer's adage of show, don't tell. What do they mean by that? What's the difference? So you recall how scenes show who is doing what. That's when you get the action, okay? Dialogue also shows how people interact with one another. Telling or presenting facts and description can be interesting too, but when you have too much description, for example, like the history of China and the history of foot binding, if you lay it out as just the history of foot binding in your book, while in between, the scenes, these dramatic scenes that are happening in your book, it can be kind of boring and kind of off-putting, and the reader will start thinking about other things and not really want to read your story anymore, right? So try and embed those facts into the scenes when possible. So I'm going to read you a passage. It's an example of showing and embedding the facts of how foot binding was done in a scene between my mother and her grandmother. My mother's name is Athu, and in my dialect, Angeng is father's mother, grandmother. When Athu was 12 years old, she was summoned to Angeng's room one evening before bedtime. Anui, you are old enough. Come, help your Angeng wash her feet. By her tone, Athu knew that the term Anui, meaning girl or daughter, was said with affection. Athu did not hesitate, as she was honored to help. Angeng, responded the girl, what do you need? She had always admired her grandmother's tiny feet. They were like a baby's, only daintier. Her own were square and blunt, ungainly in comparison. Also, she was secretly eager to see a golden lily, the term she had heard whispered by the village children. There was something exotic, but also shameful, in the term that she did not quite understand. On the floor by her grandmother's wooden pallet bed, an enamel basin was filled with warm water and sweet-smelling herbs for soaking. With a grunt, her grandmother crossed one leg over the other and, hunching down, reached toward her foot to remove a tiny, embroidered black cloth shoe. It was about 3 inches long, only slightly larger than a toddler's. The foot was still encased in cloth. Angeng found the end of the soft binding and started to unwind it carefully from around her foot. After a few turns, she stopped and handed the well-worn, yellowish bundle to Athu, indicating with a nod of her head that the girl should complete the task. Pressing her lips together tightly in concentration, Athu took the roll from her grandmother and, as she had observed, held the unraveled end tautly in her small hands as she completed the task. When the last of the binding fell away to reveal the deformed limb, her body tensed, and she felt tears of sorrow flowing like hot lava down her face, splashing down on what remained of her grandmother's foot. Still, she said nothing. No words could express her horror. This thing was as white as a lily, but it was like no flower that Athu had ever seen. Dangling from the pale, bony, atrophied calf was something that resembled a large white shrimp. The foot was bent, doubled over on itself, so that the front, where the toes should have been, was facing down, all the digits except the big toe turned under. The toe-encrusted ball of the foot faced the flat of the heel, with only a narrow space between them. The big toe itself was stunted. Looking at this broken foot, Athu realized that her grandmother walked, if her hobbling could be called that, on the base of her heels. Sighing audibly, Angeng dropped the naked foot into the warm foot bath. No need to cry, my dear, Angeng said. Grandmother's feet don't hurt now. For once, Athu was reluctant to ask how and why, but Angeng told her story quietly, as her weeping daughter continued to gently release the other foot from its binding. I was 4 years old when my feet were bound. Before that, I was free to walk, run, and jump, just like you. First, my feet were cleaned, the toenails cut, and then warm, wet towels were wound around my feet. They were still small, but even so, the bindings chafed, and I couldn't walk as before. My balance was all wrong. The first time my feet were released, I thought they were on fire. I was taught how to rub them and my legs to help the circulation. Just when I hoped the people who had changed their minds, the bindings were put back on again. Each time, the wrappings were bound tighter and tighter. As my feet grew, they turned the 4 small digits under each foot. Whenever I walked, each step crushed the bones of my toes, but I never gave up. I don't remember when the binding started to force the front of my feet down to my heel. I learned how to care for them. Eventually, my feet needed the bindings to feel supported. The whole process must have taken about 10 years. At least, that's when the pain started to dull. My feet stopped growing when I was 15 or so, and in all that time, I don't remember ever sleeping through the night. But Angeng, who did this terrible thing to you? She thought surely it must have been evil people who had forced such cruelty upon her beloved Angeng. Hadn't she heard that bandits did unspeakable things to girls? Didn't your mother try to stop them? It was my grandmother and my mother, of course. But that's so unfair. Yes, unfair and unjust, because only girls suffer like this. It was tradition. Their own feet had been bound. Some traditions are good, some aren't. Unfortunately, we can't always tell the difference until it's too late. They believed that this would help me find a good husband. I don't blame them. In one thing, they were right. I was content with my life and my marriage. And then she whispered into her granddaughter's ear, "But I don't think the size of my feet made any difference." Times are changing, and none of you girls will live with this tradition. When you're older, you'll understand that justice is worth fighting for. Right. So grandmother never gave up, and then she, in turn, fought for that, for her children, for her grandchildren. That's right. So you can embed the facts of how foot binding was done with the scene where it's grandmother telling her, not me telling my reader. So putting it all together, organization is key. You can do whatever works for you to keep things organized, but also keep in mind that an outline, a chapter outline, is going to be required for all nonfiction book proposals. So however you do it, this helped me. I created a table because it helped me visualize how I was going to organize the thing. So I basically alternated between a chapter on my mother, who was, going to be the basic focus of a particular chapter, and then a chapter on my father. So it was like, meanwhile, in Canada, this is what was happening. And so this was a table that I used, and it is chronological so I highlighted some pieces in there because, again, that helped me get organized. I didn't highlight it when I was working on it. It's just for this. So you've got the chapter and the title. You've got, I put the year that I was writing about because it helped remind me how old the characters were during that time frame. Because math is not my strong suit. So the purple highlight is the main focus of that chapter. What you're going to be writing about, what's the scenes, what the background details are. And the final, it's supposed to be green, blue, turquoise, is a reminder for the bibliography. What were the sources that I used? Because when you come to put your bibliography together, sometimes you have so much information you don't know how to organize it, and of course this helps you organize that. Because you will be having to write the bibliography and the indexes yourself, not your editor. Tip 8, write, revise, revise, revise again, and maybe even revise again. So very few writers can claim to write a perfect first or even second or even third draft. So don't be discouraged by having to rewrite. Each time you write, put it away for a day or so, come back to it with fresh eyes. You'll see new stuff, you'll get new ideas, and it will help you improve each time. One book that helped me was a book called Manuscript Makeover. It's actually revision techniques no fiction writer can afford to use. Again, I'm writing nonfiction, but I'm using the techniques of fiction writing. Tip number 9, backup, save. Use a thumb drive, use a separate hard drive, use the cloud, but remember the cloud is not infallible. I don't know if any of you were TELUS customers when they lost a whole bunch of stuff on their cloud. Do it often as you write. Every time I leave the room, I hit save. And especially at the end of the day, press save. My computer crashed while I was writing this book, and I lost a whole section. And you can imagine the panic that ensued. It was beyond belief. But luckily we were able to retrieve it. I was very lucky, but it taught me a lesson. Save, save, save. Don't forget, save. Now when editing, you might have some really beautiful language or just stuff that you fall in love with, right? Every once in a while you fall in love with a particular sentence or a scene, but it might not be quite relevant or fit into this particular scene or in this particular part. Cut and save those edited pieces onto another document. You can use it another time. You can perhaps use it to recreate a short story that you can submit for publication or for a contest. I probably have a whole other manuscript just from these saved pieces. Tip number 7, get feedback. Writing is a very lonely piece of work, living inside of your own head. So take it outside of your head by first reading your stuff out loud. When you're looking at the same passage day in, day out, your eye misses stuff because it will jump over things because your brain is expecting stuff. But when you read it out loud, you have to engage another part of your brain. And you'll see mistakes, you'll see stuff that you don't know why you didn't notice it before. Whether it's dialogue or scenes, you can hear whether they work or not better when you read it to yourself. You may even get bored yourself by the description that you've put in. And so now that will give you an idea of when you can start presenting that information in a different way. Have others whose opinions you trust read your work. It could be your spouse, it could be your friends, but most people, unlike Phil's wife, will say, "It's great, I love it, it's terrific." But that's not the kind of feedback you want. It's nice to hear, but it's not very useful. And it's not about hurting your feelings or not, but helping you hone your craft. So the kinds of questions and feedback you need is, what scenes are compelling, which aren't? What does this dialogue sound like? Does it sound like real people talking to one another? Or does it sound stilted, like you've made it up? How can it be improved? Not can it be improved, how can it be improved? Join or start a writer's group. So you've got a whole bunch of people here who are interested in writing. Maybe some of you can get together again and become a writer's group who can give each other feedback. I've created 3 in my time. The first one wasn't successful at all. It was after I took my creative nonfiction course. But I've started another one in 2007, and they're still meeting every single week without me now because I created it in Mazatlan. And I'm currently part of a group that meets once a month. Now, to be successful, a writing group has to have writers who are actively engaged in writing and that they're dedicated to their particular project. They really want to finish it. So if you have people who are saying, "I'd like to write, but I just don't have time, I'm so busy, I can't do it this week, and I can't," it's not going to work. You have to have people who have a particular project and they're dedicated to it. You might not be expert writers, doesn't matter. You're readers, you know what you like, you know what you don't like, you know what works, you know what doesn't work for you. And you can give that kind of feedback to the people who are reading to you. But you also have to be diplomatic in the kind of feedback you give. You don't need to just trash a piece because it's horrible, even though it is horrible, but provide practical, useful, kind advice, because we've all been there. The Canadian Authors Association is a group other than the Writers Union. Their motto is "Writers Helping Writers" since 1921. The Vancouver branch is very active. It holds open mics, so this is a time that you can test out your reading to an audience and test out the audience reaction to your reading. You don't need to be a member. Okay. Sign on to Blue Pencils and pitch sessions at conferences. Be an active participant. Test the market, build your platform or audience and writing credentials, because if you're going to go to the publishing route, they will want to know what your platform is. So do you have a blog? Are you on social media? Do you have a website? What are your writing credentials? What else have you published? Write to contests and do all the kinds of things that Phil told us about in his talk about short stories. It's those kinds of things that will help you build your writing cred. Hire expert help. There is actually a website that I can give you, and you can continue to do that. So I've got a write-up here with some resources that will help you with suggestions in terms of some of the courses that you can take, some of the free stuff that's available for you to help you continue on in your writing. I tell everybody about the Surrey International Writers Conference because it gives you access to international authors, international agents, and publishers. And it was there that I was able to get the interest of an agent who I didn't sign with, but who actually gave me the confidence to continue on. Look for mentorships. The Vancouver Public Library has a writing program, a writer-in-residence program that offers mentorship opportunities. I was just a mentor for Diaspora Dialogues. Their next intake is November the 11th, that's their deadline. And if you have a full manuscript ready, then you can apply for a mentorship there, which is about a 6-month mentorship that I did, but there's also a short one as well. And I'm going to give you some resources for publishers, Canadian publishers, and Canadian editors. So that about wraps up my talk.
So thank you very much.
We're done.
Renee, for sharing some of the
Okay, so this is the resources, and then I've summarized all the tips for you. So believe in yourself. Believe in yourself and your story.
Oh, he bought us 10 more minutes.
So we have 10 more minutes and we have some time. And I'm going to give you these out. I made my own bibliography, and as you can see, for each chapter, I identified the resources I was going to, that I actually did use. If you didn't use them, then you don't have to refer to them. But sometimes it's really useful to include them in your bibliography because it's useful for somebody reading your book. Like for example, in City and Color, I put together quite a large bibliography because I thought that it might be useful for history students. That's why organization is key. Either file it, I don't know, I never use cards, but some people use cards. I just filed it on my computer. If I took out a book, I immediately put it in there, and if I didn't use it, fine, but if I did, I didn't have, and I also put in the call number from the library so that I could get it easily. Details. Okay, so this book is based on stories that my mother told me. So these are the stories that I remember her telling me. I also recorded some of her stories. So these are the kinds of things that she and her grandmother talked about. And again, it's not going to be the exact words that my mother and my grandmother said to each other, but these are the kinds of things that they talked about. And she did, learn about justice and standing up for herself from her grandmother.
I was curious about the decision to deciding between fiction, calling something fiction, versus deciding it's going to be creative nonfiction. You referred previously to the Frey situation, and how do you think a person should think about that?
About how to decide which genre to use?
Yeah, whether you should consider it nonfiction or fiction.
Okay.
When you're writing a story,
yeah.
In a certain sense, they talk about the emotional truth one way or another. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious about the decision process of saying that it's nonfiction versus whether it's...
I'll give you an example of something that I'm struggling with now. I'm going to be writing a follow-up book. My sister is the oldest child. She is exactly 20 years older than I am. She was born in China. And by the time that my mother was able to come to Canada, my sister was 18 years old and she decided to stay in China. So the only time she met my father was when she was 13 years old, when he came back and they had my brother. And he only stayed there for about a year. And then she had another opportunity to meet him when she was in her 40s, and that was it. So she had a whole life in China, and she took me to China we traveled to China about 5 years ago, exactly 5 years ago now, so that she could show me what her life was like in China. So she took me to all her schools, we met up with all the friends that she'd had for over 80 years of her life, and I really want to write about that. So when I traveled, I taped her conversations with her friends, and I would ask them, what was life like? Because she lived through the communist, they all lived through the Japanese invasion, the communist revolution, and the Cultural Revolution. And I wanted to know what those periods of their life was like, because, it wasn't easy. And they would not tell me. They would say, oh, we had such a great time as students, your sister and I would do this, that, and the other, and we had wonderful. So I'm missing a whole other reality about their lives. I'm not going to write that as not creative nonfiction. I'm going to write that as a fiction book, because I don't have enough information in order to recreate any of those conversations or any of those events that happened. I know from reading about the Cultural Revolution how horrible, how little food that they had. I was there during the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, and so we know that there was a lot of deprivation and a lot of very dangerous situations, but they would not talk about that. And so that decision for me is going to be easy. I don't have enough information to really recreate their lives as a true story. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for spending time with me this afternoon.